The mission is simple: to help high achievers naturally eliminate emotional and physical obstacles so they can optimize their life for higher achievement. Welcome. You have just entered the Genesis Zone. Good day, and welcome to the Genesis Zone show. This is Dr. Brian Brown. Thank you for taking time out of your busy schedule to be with us here today. I know you could be a million other places. You've chosen to be here with us, and we so appreciate that. As usual, you're in for a great treat today. In our ongoing Wellness Warriors series, today we're joined by Dr. Vijay Sinh. Over the past 15 years, she has made it her mission to help people uncover the secrets to having healthy, long, and satisfying relationships. I think that's something every single one of us could benefit from. As a licensed psychologist and relationship expert with a PhD from Columbia University, she has helped enhance every conceivable type of relationship and couple. Dr. Sinh is a nationally recognized relationship expert and go-to source for relationships, dating, and emotional health advice. Her mission is to help others thrive in their relationships and learn the unspoken rules of healthy partnership. In this servant leader segment, Dr. Sinh will share her expert knowledge in the area of relationship wellness. Welcome to the show, Dr. Sinh. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Brian. Great to see you. Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much for being here and joining us on the Genesis Zone show. Before we dive into the main focus of our interview, our listeners would love to have a little bit of background into who you are, just so they could get to know you better. Can you share with us a little bit about your backstory, about what brought you into this specific career path and your zone of genius?
Absolutely. So one of the things that is always surprising to me about psychology is that we all get into it because there's something that really clicks with us. It resonates with us for a particular reason. And I think that what resonates with me and the work is that I've always been fascinated about how people think, how people behave, what influences them, what motivates them, what incentivizes them. And for me, this is just a journey into uncovering my own passion. So, there's all of that. And then there's also our own life story. And for me, growing up in India and being an immigrant and coming to the States at the age that I did and navigating my own relationship issues while trying to go to graduate school, have kids, have a healthy relationship with my spouse, all of those things were so challenging. And it has to be. I mean, relationships are hard things to navigate. And so I discovered that if I could do that, and if I could do that well, then maybe that's something that I can help other people with as well. So that's my passion, and that's my mission, is to help people transform themselves so that they can also transform their relationships with other people.
That's awesome. I just had this vision as you were describing your journey. I was like, oh my gosh, I had this vision of a person juggling, and I'm like, she's a juggling expert, and she teaches other people how to juggle and balance all of these things in their life. Yeah, thank you for sharing that. I know being in the mental health field, this can be a little bit of a tricky question, but is there an interesting or humorous story about something that happened to you in your professional development that you would feel comfortable sharing?
I mean, there are so many stories. Which one to get started with? I think the one that sticks with me is when I gave birth to my first child, our son, and I brought him home, and we brought him home, and there was this moment where I was struck by the enormity of the task and in the raising of this child, and wondering, oh my God, like, I'm a psychologist. I'm supposed to have answers. I'm supposed to know how, I'm supposed to be able to figure this out. And I'm struggling. So there's this aspect of humility, which is life is challenging, and life brings us to so many different places, and we all have experiences. and I'm by no manner of means perfect, and I've made my own mistakes, and I learn and grow, and that's the attitude with which I approach my work as well, is that I'm just another person that is also struggling, figuring things out, has had the resources, right? Academic resources, professional resources to understand things and navigate and make different choices. But I make mistakes too, and I'm down there in the swamps with everybody. So, that's life.
Yeah. So I love that story because you're right. I think probably one of the most humbling experiences is becoming a parent and realizing that, okay, professionally, I have all the answers for everybody, or most, people view me as that, being that person. But when it comes to affecting this little person's life and turning them into a healthy, thriving, adult, man, the gravity of that is enormous when you think about it. And you're right. I think you just have to go with it and just say, okay, I'm going to trust everything and just move forward and do the best I can. So yeah, thank you for sharing that as well. So in our servant leader segments, we focus on experts who serve their clients at the highest level. When I was prepping for the show, I found some interesting pieces of information on your website that I would like to explore a little bit more.
Sure.
You mentioned this concept called of self-care and compassion. And I think a lot of times people don't necessarily put those two on the same line. They talk about self-care, they talk about compassion, but I was just curious, explain a little bit about self-care and compassion together, because it sounds like, it looks like the way that you join those, that they do go together. And I think our listening audience would love to hear more about that.
Sure. So I think of self-care as an attitude, which is we really owe it to ourselves to be there for ourselves. And that means truly accepting ourselves before we can expect other people to accept us. I think that doesn't come easy, because we all have had experiences. We've all had what we call invalidating environments where we just felt that we didn't belong, or we weren't important, or our voice was not valid, or there was something that we were doing or saying that just wasn't working. So I think that part of being able to navigate the challenges of life is first being able to take care of ourselves, so that we can then start taking care of other people. And when we have a good relationship with ourselves, then we can have good relationships with other people too. So self-care is really about embracing the idea of taking care of ourselves on a daily basis, taking care of ourselves on an emotional level, a physical level, a spiritual level. But when it comes down to how we do that, it's really about checking in with ourselves and having a sense of, how am I doing? How am I being impacted by what's happening to me? How am I reacting to what someone is saying to me? What is that making me feel like? So when we tap into our emotional experience of something, and we can sit with it without judgment and with compassion, then we open up a space for being able to understand ourselves at a much deeper level. And then that allows us to understand other people at deeper levels too.
Yeah, I totally agree. Let me ask this. So I know you and I probably see clients like this a lot. I'm assuming, I'm going to ask you, the couple that comes in, and one of the partners in the couple is they do really well at self-care, and the other partner does not. They do really well at taking care of other people, but not taking care of themselves. What have you ever seen that clinically, first of all? And then secondly, what would you recommend for that couple? Because again, we don't want to single one person out. We view this as a whole unit. But what would you recommend for that couple to bring about a positive change in that area?
Sure. So this often happens, I think, most specifically in codependent kind of relationships, where one person has assumed the role of being the caregiver of the other person in some ways, whether it's emotional caregiving, physical caregiving, and the other person is happy to receive that and is
Mm,
happy in the role of kind of accepting that. And if you think about it, on the surface things work well, except that over time people can get very resentful and frustrated and tired and overwhelmed of being the emotional caretaker of someone else. And it's something that they've taken on themselves. Nobody set the expectation and said, this is what you need to do for me, this is what I'd like you to do for me. But somehow, through the dynamic of the relationship, one person has assumed that role or that
mm,
responsibility. And therefore, I think it's important to help them both see that this is a little bit of a pattern that might be happening, that's coming up in different places. And it's no surprise that one person is feeling more spent, or one person is feeling like they're doing all the emotional and heavy lifting, or
mm,
that they're completely burnt out because of not only having to take care of their spouse, but maybe they're also taking care of the kids, they're also taking care of other family members. This becomes also a intrapersonal dynamic, which is the person's own desire to kind of step into caregiving situations with other people. So they are going to get burnt out. And then the place it's going to reflect first is their relationship, because the other person is not, is kind of caught off guard with this sudden, I can't do this, or it's too much for me, or, something needs to change. And so therefore, it's really about bringing to their attention the idea that something like this might be happening, taking place. If that's something they can identify with, is that something they can see? And is there something that they both can do to kind of pull away from this dynamic of codependency?
mm, mm. That's great advice. And it's interesting that you pulled out that that's a very codependent dynamic. I was hoping that that's the direction you would go, because I think it's a thing that is problematic in a lot of relationships, and I think we see that play out over and over again. And it goes back to that analogy, I think, of when you're, or not really an analogy, but when you're sitting on an airplane and they're giving you pre-flight instructions, you have to put the mask on yourself, take care of yourself before you can take care of the person next to you. And that same holds true in relationships. Just curious, would there be any type of work with this couple in relationship to setting healthier boundaries? Just curious.
Absolutely. So healthy boundaries are really key to how we can function and be in a relationship, because there's
Mm,
there's only so much that we can do. There's only so much that we can tolerate at an emotional level, at an experiential level, and there's only so much that we feel comfortable with. And so we all have our own little bubble that we operate in terms of what works for us, what doesn't work for us, what we need, what we want, how we seek help, how we don't seek help, how we seek love, how we don't seek love. And so some of this is also recognizing, what are my boundaries? And if
mm,
and the more I engage in the awareness of my emotional space, the more aware I will be about when those boundaries are being stretched or pulled. But if
mm,
I'm not even aware that I'm starting to feel overwhelmed, or that I'm starting to get frustrated with a particular situation or a dynamic or event, then it'll be very hard for me to even recognize what to do with it. So, emotional awareness has to be step one, which is checking in with ourselves about how are we doing? How is this making me feel? Do I feel okay with this? Am I overextending myself? Am I putting myself in a position where I feel vulnerable? Can I handle that? And then
mm,
once we start to ask those kinds of questions, then it becomes easy for us to know, okay, what do I need to do to dial back or dial things down?
mm, mm. Excellent, excellent, excellent. Um, let's shift gears just a little bit um, into conflict and managing conflict, because I mean, when we're in relationship with someone, whether it's an intimate relationship or a work relationship, invariably there will probably be conflict involved somewhere along the way. Um, is there anything that you recommend that's like, oh man, that's just the one thing that we have to pay attention to when it comes to conflict resolution, conflict management, that you see that is very helpful with the work that you do?
Yeah. So, conflicts, just to kind of lay this out, conflicts are very, very natural.
Mm,
And and sometimes we can exert a lot of time and energy trying to avoid conflicts.
mm,
And while that's certainly something we can do, because we don't want to have to put out fires where we don't need fires, but the inevitability is that conflicts will exist in any relationship, in any marriage, in any partnership, right?
mm,
Conflicts are a very essential part of the dynamic. So let's first normalize that it's okay to have conflicts. That the idea is not to try and go about avoiding and never having conflicts.
mm,
The second piece of this is that when there is a conflict, it's really important to recognize and be curious about the other person's experience, because I think in a situation where we feel so invested in our voice, our needs, our wants, it's very hard to be able to step outside of that box and think about what was going on for the other person.
mm,
How were they feeling? How were they acting? Um, because once we are truly able to be open and curious about that, then we might be able to empathize a little bit more with their struggle and not be so invested in the place that we're coming from. But this can be very, very hard to do, because sometimes we can be so emotionally invested about the things that are important to us, whether they're our values or certain behaviors or
mm.
certain expectations, that it's really hard to let that go and be able to see things from another point of view or another perspective. And that gets us stuck in a place of always feeling at odds with one another. So I think the first thing is that we have to start to learn to develop, to be a little bit more open-minded, and to be, for a period of time, hold back on our defensiveness and just be able to listen to the other person's point of view and perspective. And
Mhm.
then maybe we'll have a place where we can share ours as well. But that has to be the first step towards understanding what happened, what took place, and what's
Mm.
unfolding.
I love it. I love it. Put ourselves in the other person's shoe, even though it may not necessarily feel comfortable at the time, but allow ourselves to, um, put ourselves on the back burner just for a second and say, how was this person feeling? What was going on in their life? What was going on in their world that could have led to this? Um, and going back to the very first thing you said, realizing that conflict is normal and we shouldn't be afraid of it. It shouldn't be a scary thing. Um, do you feel like that is not like a natural instinct for people in general, whether it's a couple relationship or it's an individual just dealing with conflict in everyday life? Do you find that's a not necessarily a natural way of thinking?
I think that for a lot of us, we grew up in families where anger and confrontation is not labeled as a good thing.
Mm,
It's something that's frowned upon. It's something that's meant to be minimized. Yeah, it's something to be afraid of. Or we've grown up in households and environments where anger was very explosive and anger was very scary, and
mm,
anger meant that something bad or dangerous was going to happen.
mm,
So when we come from those two worldviews, it's very easy for us to seek to minimize anger very quickly when we see it. Seek to minimize conflict, not be confrontational, go with the flow, be people pleasing. And so I think when we start taking it to the extreme, it can actually be very detrimental and harmful to us, because it means that we never allow for there to be an
mm,
open conversation about what's not working, because everything has to work and we're all getting along great and everything is fine and nothing's really the problem. So it's important to strike a balance between not being overly critical and cynical and harsh and
mm,
pessimistic, and at the same time, not be too toxically positive, which is to not, be in denial about things that might be happening, or defensive about how people might be feeling in our effort to try and minimize the conflict because it makes us uncomfortable.
mm. So if I'm hearing you correctly, if you're on opposite ends of the spectrum, one end of the spectrum being, um, you know, conflict is bad and we just shut it down, so we don't address it, we don't talk about it, Or if you're on the opposite end of the spectrum and the conflict becomes nuclear, they're equally as detrimental because it allows for no communication. Is that correct?
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
in any relationship, there has to be a healthy balance between being supportive, nurturing, and kind with the other person, but also being able to challenge them about things that are not working and being able to confront situations that might be coming up that might not be working for you. I think
Yes.
we do ourselves a disservice when we feel that a happy, cordial relationship is a relationship where there just are no problems between two people.
Mm-hmm. Very good. I love that. So how do you, I mean, we, and this is an overgeneralization, but you hear this statement all the time. We all come into a relationship with our own emotional baggage. Would you speak to that first of all, and then secondly, do you hear that a lot as well? And if so, how do you deal with it?
Yeah. So the way I think about emotional baggage is the trauma that we might have experienced. And for a lot of us, it doesn't have to be a big event that happened in our lives. It can just be something as simple and subtle as a neglectful parent, or an overly critical parent, or an experience at school where we felt invalidated, or growing up feeling that we identify a certain way, but never quite feeling able to voice that or give that expression. So we all have experiences in our life where we felt less than, where we felt that it was better to kind of stay hidden and to kind of silence our voice. And while this might have been this mechanism might have been protective for some part of our lives, because a lot of us go through life just keeping quiet and not saying anything and just kind of going with the flow of things. I think over time, these things catch up with us. And when they do catch up with us, they emerge in the form of conflict that we have with other people. And quite frankly, the conflict that we're having with ourselves, because we aren't able to contain ourselves when we feel triggered by the things that other people do that remind us of what we went through, or they remind us of that parent, or they remind us of that experience. And so then we get trapped in a little bit of a time bubble, which is all of this stuff happened like years and years and years ago, and I supposedly should have gotten over it, and it supposedly should have never bothered me in the first place. But here I am having a reaction about my wife rolling her eyes because that reminds me of what my mother used to do when we used to have a fight. So all of these things can, we our body holds memories, and we're extremely good at being able to repress and put things away because we need to be able to adapt and grow and move forward. But all of these things are there in that reservoir, and if we don't take care of them, and if we don't acknowledge them, and we don't pay attention to them, then they come up in the way that we treat other people and in the way that we treat ourselves.
So I think you're talking about the triggers there that can, from that emotional baggage, that can trigger those conflicts, such as that reminds me of my mother, so on and so forth. Do you find that triggers or those internal scripts that play without us realizing it sometimes, do you think that they are just truly like rote memory, like I'm remembering this about this particular person or this particular circumstance? Or can it also be sensory, like a smell triggers that, or a sight triggers that, or a sound triggers that? I think the listening audience would love to hear your perspective on that.
Absolutely. It can be engagement through any of the senses, right? So a sound I heard, if I had to keep driving if my family had to keep driving my oldest sibling to the emergency room because of the multiple suicide attempts that he made, and the sound of sirens and the sound of fire trucks and the sound of ambulances might be very scary to me. Like for me, it can be very palpable, where I hear it and it just sets off a whole chain of events in my mind and in my heart, and my breathing goes up and my heart rate goes up. And so all of these things can impact us in ways that we sometimes don't even recognize and we don't even realize. And so in some ways, then we're always being pulled along by unconscious memories and unconscious events and unconscious representations of things that have happened to us. And so in our conscious, the more we bring these things to our conscious awareness, the less of a role they play in our lives. The more aware we are of how they might be showing up and what they're about. And so then the next time I hear an ambulance going by, I can be like, I know that I'm reacting to something that happened a long time ago. But ambulances can also be a sign that someone's getting the help that they need. And so I can change the script for myself in a way that it does not have to be bothersome and problematic for me anymore, that it can be changed into something positive and that I can have a much better reaction to and not like avoid going to hospitals for the rest of my life.
Right. So we can reframe those over time by bringing them into the conscious and talking through them and working through them.
Yes, we can totally rewrite the script on how things impacted us, what the meanings that we assign to them, the importance that they hold in our lives. And we can only do that when we acknowledge them and we bring them to the surface and we allow them to be there, as opposed to, pushing them aside, not wanting to deal with them, not wanting to touch them.
Do you ever find that some people are ready to actually do that level of work, and then some people are not ready to do that level of work?
Yeah, there's always it's always fascinating to me how scary this work can be. And I think that this is the thing about therapy, is that there isn't always necessarily a feel-good factor. When you finish a session, it's not like you're jumping for joy and be like, that was the best session ever, right? Like it could be, oh my God, thank God that's over. It felt like someone was pulling hair. But I think that it really depends on like how much we have struggled with our past. And I think the more we struggle with our past and the more we see how it's influencing our present, the more likely we are to want to do something about it, to change. I'm done. I'm so done with the way that I'm approaching men because of what my dad did to me, what my dad did to my mom like 30 years before. Like, I'm so done with this. I need to live my life. And then there are people who are like, I'm not sure if I want to do that kind of work and if I'm ready for that. And unfortunately, sometimes we suffer a little bit before we realize that this is important work that we have to get to, that it cannot be avoided or postponed, that there's a price that we pay when we make certain choices about what we do.
Great. I totally agree. And I see that clinically as well. And it is that it is always remarkable when you see the person with the deepest hurt, the deepest trauma. They're the ones that make the fastest progress when they're working in therapy, versus the person that, not to minimize a person's trauma, but a person that has a lesser trauma, so to speak. It's like, it feels like you're having to drag them sometimes through that process. Yeah. Now, when we first started this conversation, you mentioned, taking care of yourself first before you can take care of someone else.
Yeah.
You mentioned finding yourself first. I'm curious if finding yourself first is a different concept versus taking care of yourself first.
Yes. You're absolutely right. And the two of them are related, but they are very different things. So I think finding yourself first means being really clear with yourself about who you are as a person and what your values are. I think that when we pay attention to the things that are important to us, the ideas that we want to live our life by, the things that we absolutely cannot do without, then that helps bring more clarity into the person that we want to become. And so it goes hand in hand with our emotional awareness and taking care of ourselves, because when something feels out of step, when I'm pursuing something that I think is a value, but is bringing up for me a lot of different emotional experiences that I'm not feeling comfortable with, it's then an opportunity to reflect and think about what's happening here. Something's not in alignment, right? I really want to do this, but something seems to be getting in the way. Is it fear? Is it guilt? Is it resentment? And why is that coming up? Is it shame or embarrassment? And why is that coming up? Because when we want to pursue a goal, but we have no idea about how there are like challenges that are coming up in the way that we're responding to that particular goal, then we're just blindly following a path without really understanding what it involves. And then when we experience setbacks, we're throwing everything at it. It's like, maybe I'll do this and I'll fix it. Maybe I'll do this and I'll fix that. And meanwhile, we're not paying attention to our emotional experience to it that is playing a huge role in terms of why that goal is not being, achieved in the way that it should be achieved.
Which do you find easier for people, the self-care or the finding themselves, or is it equally balanced? I'm just curious.
I think that if we are paying attention to self-care as not a concept that we visit every now and then, but if we think about it as something that really helps us have a deeper understanding of ourselves and have a deeper understanding of our values and goals, then it's something that we can pursue simultaneously. And that it doesn't have to be self-care can't be one of those things. I'll take care of myself on Saturday and Sunday, and then Monday through Friday, I'll just wing it. And so see ya Saturday and Sunday for my meditation session. And then the rest of the week I'm out. And so, because, I've done things like that. I've been a busy professional where it just felt like there wasn't the time to attend to myself, because there was so much else that needed my attention. There was so many people that I needed to help. I could always put a million other things before I put myself on the list of things that I needed to do. And so I think that it unfortunately, it took a lot of setbacks and it took a lot of kind of falling on my knees for me to realize, wait a minute, like the priority list here has to change. Something has to change here, and I have to put myself up on the list. And I found that when I did do that, it was way easier for me to show up for my patients. It was way easier for me to accomplish my goals. It was way easier for me to be able to get things done. So for me, it's, sometimes we learn things the hard way, and sometimes we have to figure out like what the right combination is. And that, for different people, that looks like different things. So it's a little bit of a, you have to try and test it out kind of approach.
And it's so refreshing to hear you say that you had to deal with some of these things yourself, just in clinical practice, and taking, all the excuses that we can list as reasons why I can't do that. And then you have to fall on your knees sometimes to say, oh, wait a minute, I have to do this. And it's refreshing to hear you say that. I think not a lot of people, professionally especially, are willing to admit that, hey, I've been there, I've done that. Got the scars to prove it, and hey, we're improving one step at a time. So thank you for that.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So when you talk about this next concept that popped up, people pleasing, I think images and words and examples pop into people's heads immediately, because we've either all been a people pleaser at one time, or we know people pleasers. This may be very similar to what we talked about earlier in the conversation, but what are some dynamics that you see with people pleasing, and what are some ways that if a person is struggling with people pleasing, how can they break that cycle?
Very good question. So when it comes to people pleasing, I think that it often happens as like we're not even aware that we're doing it. If you are, not everybody is aware that they're a people pleaser, right? So for many years in my own life, I never considered myself a people pleaser, because I always thought of myself as a very strong, independent young woman. I used to make choices for myself. I didn't depend on other people to make choices or help me or support me. And I had no problems with being confrontational or had no problems with challenging people. That's never been an issue for me. So I never considered myself a people pleaser. But I think the way that people pleasing shows up for a lot of people is in the idea that they have to also be perfect at everything. And I think that becomes a pursuit. And then when that becomes a pursuit, there's a way in which other people get drawn into it, right? So So if let's say my aim is to be a good clinician and to also be a great mom and to also be a fantastic wife and to also be a great sister to my sister and daughter to my parents. And so when I start moving in the aim of trying to accomplish all of these different things, now I have in some ways recruited other people in my own desire for perfection. So without them having volunteered themselves and without me having even be consciously aware of the fact that I'm doing that. So I think that's the insidious side of people pleasing, is that sometimes this desire to be great at everything and to really make sure that all our bases are covered. But I think the other way that I also see people pleasing come up is this idea of being inherently not good enough and being unworthy. And I think that when we struggle with not feeling good enough, not feeling worthy, not feeling valuable in some ways, then it feels like that's the only thing that we can do to make sure that people appreciate us, to make sure that people are there for us, to make sure that we're loved and we're wanted. And then it becomes this dynamic between us and other people where we seek other people's approval and we seek other people's validation. And meanwhile, really, the only person's validation that we actually really need is ourselves. And we don't have that. And so we keep seeking it in other people, never fully satisfied and feeling completely burnt out and resentful. And I think that's when, that aha moment comes up where it's like, what the hell am I doing? And why am I doing this?
I love how you put that. If I can paraphrase, because of our self-image issues, our low self-esteem, our desire to feel validated, we recruit other people many times against their will to be pulled into this dynamic of people pleasing when they didn't even ask for it. Is that correct?
They don't ask for it, and then they sometimes get used to it. And then when they get used to it, and then they have certain expectations from us, and then we pull back, or we say, wait a minute, and they're like, what? But this is what I expect from you. This is what you do.
So it leads to conflict.
It leads to conflict, and it can lead to confusion, and it can lead to people feeling that you're either punishing them if you then hold up some boundaries and say, okay, I think I'm going to dial this back, right? Or I don't think I can do this anymore. And so I think that we have to be very careful when we are aware that we may have been engaging in people pleasing, and now it's time to reinforce some boundaries. Now it's time to maybe hold back a little, pull back a little, and just being mindful of how that might impact other people. Because chances are people might not take too well to us suddenly saying no.
Yeah, it's interesting how when the dance changes, like two people are dancing the same dance and one person decides to stop dancing that dance, the other person can either continue dancing the old dance or they can come along with the new person and dance the new dance. And I think that's the crux, at least that's the way I see it, the crux of relationship type therapy is figuring out the old dance and figuring out the new dance. Is that a fair assessment?
Yes, absolutely. Sometimes the music can change on you and you have no other choice.
Right, exactly.
to start dancing a different kind of step. Yes.
That's right.
Or you can protest wildly. Hey, Mr. DJ, what's happening?
Yeah, exactly. Let's talk a minute about gratitude. And then kind of, I'll wrap up my piece there and I'll just kind of let you take it and run with it. But let's wrap up with gratitude. How do you envision, or how do you incorporate gratitude into work with into relationship work with couples?
Yeah, I think this also ties into what we said earlier about self-care and compassion, because I think that when we are able to be compassionate with ourselves, we can truly also be grateful about the things that we have that are working for us, that we are doing well, ways in which we're showing up that are worthy. And I think that it's so easy to be hard on ourselves, and it's so easy to look at the list of things that didn't get done, and it's so easy to think about time as having been wasted, and I wasn't as productive, and this wasn't as meaningful. And I think that the idea of always looking at the glass as kind of being half empty can take us into a place of getting burnt out very quickly. So I think the more we can practice compassion for ourselves, that it was a rough week. I went through some pretty terrible life-changing events. I was diagnosed with COVID. My spouse was diagnosed with COVID. Like, we both tested positive. We were trying to take care of the kids. So it wasn't. So when we start looking at from the lens of I'm doing my best to show up and I can cut myself a break, is also when we can be grateful. It opens up the heart for a little bit more space to just feel a little bit more positive about the things that are happening in our lives, that are going well, that we're doing well, that we can be grateful for. And I think that when we can be grateful for the things that are happening in our lives, and then we can be grateful for other people, and then that also builds on the empathy and the compassion. So it just becomes, it's one big cycle, one big circle of empathy, compassion, and gratitude.
That's a good word. Other than what we've talked about, are there any other nuggets or advice or wisdom that you'd like to share with the audience regarding, relationship health?
Sure. So the only one thing that I would say here is to understand and recognize that repairs are a very essential part of conflict and conflict management. So while we are always going to be in conflict with one another, because when you're dealing with two people, someone's going to disagree, someone's going to have a different point of view. We're not miniature cloned versions of ourselves. So it's that is bound to happen. And I think what's important is to really think about how are we going to repair those moments when we are in conflict with one another, and how are we going to heal ourselves and also help the other person heal. And now I'm talking about the big moments that might happen in a relationship, right? Where someone's trust is breached, where someone feels like they have been led astray, where someone feels like someone has really hurt them or harmed them in a way that they cannot deal with. And so I think in those moments, it's really important that a relationship has the capacity to come back together. It has the breathing space, it has the muscle memory to come back together. And there has to be some work into repairing things, and not just expecting that things will magically sort themselves out. That it's just a question of like having a conversation. It's just a question of being there. It's just a question of doing X, Y, and Z. A lot of work has to go back into trying to repair the hurt that's been caused, the damage that's been caused to the relationship and to both people.
Do you often find that when, let's say it was a major area of trust that was broken, and the couple is willing to do the deep work, the hard work, do you find that oftentimes their relationships are even better after the fact than they were before?
It just varies. It depends on how we approach the event that happened, that took place. It depends on whether we are willing to grieve the loss of the relationship that we used to have. Because when something big happens, it's almost like saying goodbye to the relationship that you and I used to have, and now becoming accepting of this new place that our relationship has stepped into. Right. So it also is, so the ability to be able to grieve that, to be able to acknowledge that, and to be able to let that go. Because when we don't let go, then we hold on to resentment, and we hold on to a lot of blame, and we hold on to a lot of criticism. So I think it means being able to grieve that, and be able to open our hearts up to this next chapter. And if that can happen, then there is a possibility that we can find our way back to one another. But if it's really hard for us to let go of that which happened, which took place, and we're getting stuck in that cycle of feeling anger and hurt and disappointment, and it's hard to let that go. And for every couple, it looks differently, and it has to be resolved a different way based on what their circumstances are. So yes, it is hard, but can it be done? Yes.
And I love what you said just a moment ago, that realizing that you need that help and getting that help is essential. And I liken it to, there's something, if you're driving a car, there's sometimes that if you have a flat tire, you can change that flat tire yourself. But if you have a flat tire that causes you to run off in the ditch, you can't get that car out of the ditch. You're going to have to call a professional to come help you get that car back up on the road or get it to a place where it can be fixed. And I think the same thing holds true for relationships and therapy work, working with a clinical psychologist or a licensed counselor or therapist to make certain that you're able to get that the vehicle back up on the road so that you can continue the journey.
Yes, I'm just reading some research that it takes, couples are usually in conflict for average of 6 years before they seek out help.
Wow.
That statistic was just astounding to me, because it just shows the amount of time and effort, the pain that we experience and we subject ourselves to before we're willing to kind of, hold up the flag and say, okay, I think this is something that we need help with. And when it comes to therapy, and you probably know this, or any kind of professional help, prevention is always better than an intervention. I mean, intervention is fine if it needs to happen, but it's always better to get to the problem before it's become a big burning fire.
Exactly. It's the old joke in family practice where the guy's hitting his hand with the hammer, and he said, "Doc, it hurts when I do this." And you say, "Well, quit doing that. Get the help." And no, I'm going to sit here and do this for 6 years. I'm going to hit my hand with a hammer. And that's the equivalent of what people do in relationships, I think, many, many times. But you're right. The earlier you catch it, the faster we can bring about this repair work and this healing. So just curious, are there any interesting projects that you're working on right now?
Well, currently I'm just working night and day in terms of just some like diversity stuff and cultural stuff. We're in a place in time where there's so much that's happening, and it's really tugging at my heart. So I'm really trying to work on, I'm very passionate about getting messages related to mental health and culture and diversity as they relate to mental health into mainstream media. So that's become a project of mine. But I'm always into relationship work, and quite frankly, I'm also into my own relationship work, which is, I've been married for 20 years, and it hasn't come without its part of struggles, and it's part of repairs, and all of the good stuff that relationships come with. So, I'm moving along, chugging along in progress as I'm trying to help other people as well.
Very good. Very good. I always like ending the show with kind of a fun question. And when I was reading through your website and your pre-interview questions, I thought this would be a really good question to ask Dr. Singh. Which talent or superpower would you most like to have if you could magically be endued with that power?
Wow, so many. Which one to choose from? I think the power that I would like to have would be the one of just kind of being, I used to nickname myself Supergirl, like, go figure, like with all the perfectionism stuff and everything else, right?
Right.
But for me, it also meant being able to be in all the places that I wanted to be whenever I wanted to be in, or be able to transform myself into, be able to, I can like go through a pipe, I can show up magically in a place. And that to me was just fascinating, because I can be in all these places that I want to be, just as my heart desires. So yeah, that would be pretty cool, to suddenly be able to cross continents and, be somewhere, be in a different part of the world in a heartbeat.
I would love to have that superpower. I love to travel. That would be great.
Yeah, absolutely. Wouldn't it be great? Like, you could go to all these different places and yeah. But what about you, Brian? What's the one superpower that you would like to have?
Oh my gosh. I'd always said something very similar, to be able to travel at the speed of thought. Just being able to think, okay, I want to be there. Boom. I want to go see so-and-so. Boom. And I'm just there.
Yeah.
So yeah, very similar to yours, actually. Yeah.
Cool.
Dr. Singh, thank you so much for sharing your expert knowledge on relationship wellness. It's hard to put into words how valuable, the information that you shared with us was today. And I so appreciate that. Thank you. Thank you.
Absolutely. Pleasure is all mine. And if you would like more resources or more information, you can always look me up on.
I was going to ask if you could share how our audience could connect with you, either on social media or through your website. How would they do that?
Yes, absolutely. So through my website and through my social media, at Dr. Vijay Singh. And there are some, resources there and tips, and, feel free to reach out. If I can be of help, I'd be happy to.
Great. And we'll also, for those listening or watching, we'll actually be posting that in the show notes as well. So you won't have to hunt for it. It'll be there for sure. Well, as we wrap up, I'd like to make our listeners aware of something new. I recently wrapped up my brand new Gene Hack Boot Camp. And it got rave reviews. Well, that means I'm going to be doing another boot camp soon. I haven't announced the date yet. We're still working out details on the calendar. It was actually more successful than I anticipated it to be for the first time around. And so I'm making it a priority to make sure that we get these boot camps on the calendar for the coming year. So in the Gene Hack Bootcamp, using my proprietary Genesis Zone method, I teach you how to know exactly which of your 5 optimization zones are out of balance. And that imbalance, those imbalances that are creating low physical energy, emotional and lower emotional and mental performance for you. And I show you how to know exactly which genes need to be checked within each of those zones in order to propel you to higher levels of physical, mental, and emotional performance. It's a power-packed 5 days that you won't want to miss. Trust me on that, especially if you want to feel healthier and stronger, find more balance, have a stronger immune system, have improved focus and concentration, have a better mood and lower anxiety, and simply have more energy, stamina, and endurance. To reserve your seat or to get placed on the waiting list for the next boot camp, go to drbriangBrown.com/gene hack, GENEHACK, and follow the instructions there. If you have any questions about the Gene Hack Bootcamp, you can just direct message me on Facebook or Instagram at Dr. Brian G. Brown. So tune in tomorrow at noon Eastern Standard Time for our next In the Zone segment, where I'll be recapping today's interview with Dr. Singh. I'll be sharing how the nuggets from this interview fit into the Genesis Zone advantage. I'll be answering any questions and exploring other relevant current event topics that relate to this. Most informed, most trusted, and most grateful that you spent this time with us today. Until next time, stay in the zone. I'm Dr. Brian Brown.